In this module, we will be talking about functional-based assessments. Functional-based assessments are oftentimes referred to as FBAs, and they're three parts. The functional of this type of assessment is to find out why a student is engaging in a particular behavior, that is the target behavior, the behavior of concern. The based means that it's the analysis that comes from the FBA is grounded in the data that has been gathered. And the assessment is gathering information about the behavior of concern, the target behavior. When conducting an FBA, FBAs attempt to answer the why the behavior is happening through asking yourself what antecedent is prompting the behavior, what consequence is maintaining the behavior of concern, and you also ask yourself, can the student be taught a replacement behavior to accomplish the same function as the target behavior? So can the student be taught the appropriate behavior you want them to do, want them to engage in, to replace that same function of that target behavior, the inappropriate behavior? All behaviors serve a function. We are either trying to access or escape something, such as getting attention, activities or tangibles or sensory stimulation. So we're either trying to get something or get out of something under three categories: attention, activities, tangibles, or sensory stimulation. Let's take, for example, the target behavior of hitting and kicking. It's important for us to remember that for some students, reprimands are irrelevant and timeouts are counterproductive. So, if we have conducted an FBA for hitting and kicking with this specific student, the hitting and kicking serve two functions: the function of attention and the function of escaping a task. Here we need to ask ourselves how we can intervene appropriately without reprimands or timeouts. To serve the function of attention, we would teach appropriate ways for that student to gain attention. For the function of escape task, we would modify the task and teach the child to ask for help. There are several steps to an FBA. The first step would be the teacher interview. What is the target behavior? So in this teacher interview, you're trying to gain what the target behavior is. What is that student doing that's inappropriate in the classroom? And to conduct a teacher interview as provided on our module, we are using the preliminary functional assessment interview. There are several questions that you go through with the teacher, such as list and describe the behaviors of concern. Prioritize these behaviors. That one is especially important. You might have a student that's engaging in multiple inappropriate behaviors. However, we cannot target every single behavior at once. We need to prioritize one behavior at a time, the most important one. Oftentimes, if we work on focusing on one behavior, the other behaviors may subside. After question number 2, there is a prompt for you to stop, and you must do this. You need to select and operationally define the target behavior, the behavior of concern. You need to provide examples and non-examples, as well as select and define a replacement behavior. What should that student be doing instead? Moving forward throughout the teacher interview, you're focusing on the target behavior. Please reference back to prior modules on how to operationally define behaviors. When conducting the teacher interview, you need to identify both target and replacement behaviors, as well as operationally define them. Again, as I said earlier, please reference back to Behavior 101 module for how to do this. Within the teacher interview, you'll be selecting the replacement behavior. The selection of the replacement behavior requires the information gathered from the teacher interview. Be sure to ask the teacher what he or she wants that student to be doing instead of that target behavior. In the teacher interview, there are some clarification points that need to be made. For the target behavior, skill deficits refer to acquisitions. So in question 14, these were Skill deficits include the can't do tasks, and these require explicit instruction from the teacher. A performance deficit is a motivation. That is, the student won't do. They can do it, but they choose not to do it. So you've seen them do it in other instances, but maybe they're not doing it in this class. In this case, performance deficits require reinforcement. Another point of clarification: if the behavior is the most severe in the chain of behaviors, try to select the behavior earlier in the chain so as to prevent the more behavior from occurring. So if we look at this series of pictures on this page, the teacher might be very concerned about a teacher or a student's outburst. The student here it looks very frustrated and maybe yelling and having a meltdown. But if we look prior in the chain of events, we can look at his desk in this first picture, and we see that the desk is extremely messy. Here, we would want to focus on, instead of the outburst, we focus on the organization of the desk that caused the frustration and caused the student to have an outburst. So again, sometimes it's not the most severe behavior that we need to be looking at. We need to look at what happens prior to that behavior and try and stop that, curtail that behavior so that it doesn't lead into a more severe behavior. In step 2, we are going to conduct direct observations. And this is where we're going to attempt to answer what's the function of the behavior. When we do direct observations, we are using an ABC data collection model that was developed by B.F. Skinner and is also the basis for behavioral analysis for more than 70 years. In step 1, we have identified the behavior. So we go into the classroom or the context in which that behavior occurs. We look for that behavior to occur, and once it occurs, we identify the antecedent of what immediately preceded that behavior, and we identify the consequence, what immediately followed that behavior. So we look for the behavior. After we see the behavior, we think back and we say what happened immediately prior to that behavior and what happened immediately following that behavior. So the antecedent is what prompts the behavior to occur. The behavior is obviously the target behavior that we've already identified, and the consequence is what immediately follows it. The consequence is the thing that's going to maintain the behavior to happen. It's important here that as teachers, we might be thinking that the consequence that we're delivering, such as a reprimand or redirecting the student, is a consequence to depress or stop the behavior from happening. But oftentimes, providing that kind of attention to a student is what they want, and that is maintaining the behavior to continue happening. So this is what we're trying to identify in an ABC model. The purpose of the ABC model is to predict and control behavior. When we are predicting, we are identifying what is likely to occur when an antecedent is happening. And when we control it, we want to alter or influence the probability of that particular behavior occurring or not occurring. So it's maintaining that behavior, and we're going to identify that and come up with strategies in order for the behavior to be appropriate within the classroom. An example for an ABC model is when Zora is in math, he talks to his neighbor. Zora is told to pay attention. In this sequence of events, the behavior is him talking to his neighbor. That's the target behavior. He's talking to his neighbor. Well, what happened immediately prior to that behavior? Well, Zora's in math class. What's the consequence? Zora gets redirected. He gets attention from the behavior. So the potential function of this behavior is getting attention from the teacher. Some frequently asked questions when conducting ABC observations. First one is, how long should I observe? Well, this completely depends on when the behavior occurs. You need to gather enough information to help you make an informed decision about the intervention or the function of the behavior. How many times should you observe? You need to observe at least 3 times. And you must have at least 2 different people collect data. You need to gather at least 15 occurrences of that behavior in order for you to gain a clear pattern of behavior. The reason why you want two different people collecting behavior is that two different people can see two different things. I might see the behavior and the sequence of events happening differently than another behavior or another observer. Therefore, it's important for you to have two people collect data and compare notes and come up with a conclusion as to why the behavior is happening. What's the function of that behavior? Some instructions for collecting ABC data is you need to determine, when you're in the classroom doing observations, you need to determine your position and seating. Are you going to be in the front of the class? Are you going to be in the back of the class? Maybe in the middle of the class or middle of the playground? But things to consider is, do you have a clear view of the student? Can you hear the student? Where can you be placed to have the least amount of influence on the student's behavior? If you're sitting right next to the student, your presence to that student likely might curtail or alter that student's behavior. Remember back to some low intensity strategies, this relates to proximity. The closer you are to a student, especially if you have status of a teacher or authority, by being next to that student or that student knowing that you're watching them can change and alter their behavior. So you want to eliminate that as much as possible. When conducting an ABC observation, you must take in a form for recording. Here's an example of a form you may use. One is provided online on the module. When conducting the observation, you're going to write down the time at which you observe the target behavior happening. So you wait and watch for the behavior to happen, you write what the behavior is, and then you need to decide what immediately preceded that behavior and write that in the antecedent column, and what immediately followed that behavior and write it in the consequence column. As your observation continues, you're going to continue looking for that target behavior and fill out the column as appropriate. For example, here you have a behavior that happened at 10:11, 10:13, 10:16, 10:30, 10:21, and 10:25. And you just fill it out, and you'll use this for analysis later. Following the ABC observations, you need to conduct a student interview. This is going to give you more information about what the function of the behavior is, as well as identify what the student will work for. The student interview is provided on the online module. It guides you through very similarly to the teacher interview with some prescribed questions for you to ask. The target behavior, again, is the behavior that the student is doing inappropriately in the classroom. I'm not going to go through these questions any further. They're pretty self-explanatory. Following the teacher interview, the student interview, and the ABC observation, you need to conduct a function matrix. This is where you're going to pull all of the information together to identify some potential functions of behavior. The function matrix is going to have several things included. It's going to have on the top positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement columns. This is where you identify the positive reinforcement as in what is the student accessing, what are they gaining, versus negative reinforcement, what are they avoiding, what are they getting out of. And then on the left-hand column, you'll see the functions: attention, activities, tangibles, and sensory. What you need to do as a team is you need to go through the teacher interview question by question and identify, is there any information in any of these questions that gives us an idea on, is the student gaining something or getting away from something? Not every single question you'll be able to fill into this matrix, but you want to get as much as you can and put them and fill them into the appropriate columns and cells. It's not perfect. You as a teacher might have an opinion about one of the questions, and another team member might have an opinion about another question. The best idea is to come up with the best conclusion and fill it in appropriately. You're going to do similarly with the student interview. Go question by question and see if there's any information that gives you an idea of what they're gaining or getting out of by way of attention, activities, tangibles, or sensory. You're also going to do this with your ABC data. You're going to go through it observation by observation, target behavior by target behavior, and look at that consequence. What is that student gaining or getting out of with using that consequence? For example, let's look at this ABC observation form. I have gone through it. I have circled each occurrence of behavior. I'm going to look at that consequence column, and I'm going to see that with that first occurrence, that student gets told by the teacher to stop that. Well, this is going to be considered attention. So that student is gaining attention. So I would put that under positive reinforcement attention. I would put D1, observation 1, or occurrence 1. And I'm going to go through that for every single time that occurs. So again, the second one, you see number 2 written on the far right-hand side. Student engages in target behavior, and a peer tells the student, page 43. Well, here I would say he's probably getting student attention. So again, I would put that under positive reinforcement attention. Occurrence 3, peer laughs and shoves his hand away when he writes on his peer's notebook. Okay, here I'm starting to see a pattern. This peer is giving the student attention. So again, I'd put this in, positive reinforcement attention. The next one, teacher says, you need to follow along. Teacher's getting attention. Put it in that same column. Peer chuckles. He's getting peer attention. And here, this last one, number 6, there's really nothing that occurred. But if I look back through the sequence of events, they're working on the assignment. The target student taps a peer's shoulder. Here I might decide not to put this in my function matrix, but he was working on his assignment. He stops his assignment and he taps his peer's shoulder. I am going to actually put this into getting away from a task. He's stopping working on his task. So I would put this occurrence into negative reinforcement task activity cell. After you've gone through all of your direct observations, all of your teacher interview, and all of your student interview, you're going to start noticing cells that are populated with more data than other cells. After you've gone through everything and you've plugged all of the information in that you can, you're going to construct a hypothesis statement. If we look at this function matrix, the hypothesis might say, when given an assignment in science class, Olivia engages in disruptive behavior to access peer attention and escape difficult tasks. Here you see most of the information is populated in gaining attention and avoiding tasks. You also are going to see some information that's put into gaining sensory stimulation. There are going to be cells where there's going to be some data that have been put in them, but it's not going to find itself in the hypothesis statement. We are trying to find the true function of that target behavior, and you need to identify the cells with the most information in it to give you a better hypothesis statement. So this is a statement that begins to explain why that particular student is engaging in the target behavior. Here's a guide that you can use to guide you through this process. It is available again on the online module, but you should complete this planning form to guide your functional assessment. It's multiple pages, and it'll give you an idea on if you've completed everything and who's done what. In conclusion, you conduct an FBA to identify the function of a behavior. FBAs take 4 steps. To complete a function-based analysis, you need to conduct a teacher interview, do direct observations using the ABC model, conduct a student interview, and then compile a function matrix to identify a hypothesis.